It was a cold, gray afternoon when Eleanor Harper and her younger brother, Thomas, arrived at Blackthorn Manor. The sprawling estate had been left to them by their late uncle, a reclusive man who had died under mysterious circumstances. The locals in the nearby village whispered about the house, calling it cursed, but Eleanor dismissed their superstitions. She was a practical woman, a journalist by trade, and had no patience for ghost stories. Thomas, on the other hand, was more sensitive to such things. At 16, he was still impressionable, and the stories the villagers told had left him uneasy. The manor loomed before them, its Gothic architecture casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. The windows were dark, like hollow eyes staring out at the world. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the silence was oppressive. As they stepped inside, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the air grew heavy, as if the house itself was resisting their presence. The interior was dimly lit, the only light filtering through the dusty windows. The walls were lined with faded portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow the siblings as they explored. Eleanor tried to remain optimistic. "It just needs a little cleaning," she said, brushing cobwebs from a dusty chandelier. "We'll make it feel like home in no time." Thomas didn't respond. He was staring at one of the portraits, a man with cold, piercing eyes. "Do you think he looks like Uncle Gregory?" he asked quietly. Eleanor glanced at the portrait. "A little, I suppose. But don't let your imagination run wild. This is just an old house. Nothing more." That night, as they settled into their rooms, Eleanor heard it for the first time, a faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. But there was no wind. The air was still. She sat up in bed, straining to listen. The whisper came again, a faint, indistinct murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She told herself it was just the house settling, but the sound lingered in her mind long after it faded. The next morning, Thomas looked pale and tired. "Did you hear anything last night?" he asked over breakfast. Eleanor hesitated. "What do you mean?" "I thought I heard someone talking," he said. "But it was so quiet, I couldn't make out the words." Eleanor forced a smile. "It's an old house. It makes noises. Don't let it spook you." But as the days turned into weeks, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, a cacophony of voices speaking in languages Eleanor couldn't understand. Thomas claimed he couldn't hear them, but she noticed how he avoided certain rooms, how he jumped at the slightest noise. He spent more and more time outside, wandering the overgrown gardens or sitting by the crumbling fountain, as if trying to escape something. Eleanor, however, was determined to uncover the source of the whispers. She began to research the history of Blackthorn Manor, scouring old records and letters left behind by her uncle. She learned that the house had been built in the 1800s by a wealthy family who had mysteriously vanished within a year of moving in. The property had passed through several owners, each meeting an untimely end. Her uncle had been the latest in a long line of victims. One evening, Eleanor decided to investigate the basement, a place she had avoided since their arrival. The stairs creaked under her weight, and the air grew damp and heavy. At the bottom, she found a door, its surface covered in strange symbols carved into the wood. The whispers were deafening now, urging her to open the door. Against her better judgment, she turned the handle. Inside was a small room, its walls covered in more symbols. In the center stood an old, ornate mirror. As she approached, the whispers stopped. The room fell silent. Then, the mirror began to ripple, like the surface of water. A hand emerged, pale and skeletal, followed by a face that was her own, but twisted, malevolent. Eleanor stumbled back, dropping her flashlight. When she looked again, the mirror was still, the room silent. She fled upstairs, her heart pounding. The next morning, Thomas found Eleanor in the kitchen. She was pale, her hands trembling as she sipped a cup of tea. "Are you okay?" he asked, concern etched on his face. "I'm fine," she lied. "Just tired." But she wasn't fine. The whispers were constant now, a relentless barrage of voices in her mind. She began to see things, shadows moving in the corners of her vision, figures standing in the hallways. And then there were the dreams, vivid, horrifying dreams of the mirror and the thing that lived inside it. One night, Thomas woke to the sound of footsteps. He followed them to the basement, where he found Eleanor standing before the mirror. She was chanting in a language he didn't recognize, her eyes blank and unseeing. "Eleanor," he shouted, grabbing her arm. She turned to him, her expression cold. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice not her own. Thomas tried to pull her away, but she was impossibly strong. She threw him across the room, his head hitting the wall with a sickening crack. Darkness closed in around him. When Thomas woke, he was alone. The basement was silent, the mirror shattered. He stumbled upstairs, calling for Eleanor, but the house was empty. In the study, he found a journal, their uncle's journal. The pages were filled with frantic scribblings about the mirror, about the entity that lived within it. Their uncle had summoned it, thinking he could control it, but it had consumed him, just as it was now consuming Eleanor. The last entry was a warning, asterisk, "If you read this, leave this place. Burn it to the ground. The mirror cannot be destroyed, but the house can. Do not let it take you too. Asterisk." Thomas knew what he had to do. He gathered what little gasoline he could find and doused the house. As he stood outside, watching the flames consume Blackthorn Manor, he thought he saw Eleanor in an upstairs window, her face twisted in rage. But when the fire died down, there was nothing left but ash and rubble. The mirror was gone, buried beneath the ruins. Thomas moved away, changed his name, and tried to forget. But sometimes, in the dead of night, he hears whispers, faint and distant, calling him back. Years later, a construction crew cleared the land where Blackthorn Manor once stood. Among the debris, they found an old, ornate mirror, its surface unbroken. And the whispers began again. Clara Hayes had always hated Willow Creek. The town was a relic of a bygone era, a place where time seemed to stand still. Nestled in a valley surrounded by dense, ancient forests, it was a town where the sun rarely pierced through the thick canopy of trees, and the air always carried a faint, earthy smell, like damp soil and decaying leaves. The townsfolk were a tight-knit community, but they were also deeply superstitious. They spoke in hushed tones of the hollow men, shadowy figures said to roam the woods at night, their faces featureless and their intentions unknown. For years, the legend of the Hollow Men was just that, a legend. But for Clara, it was about to become all too real. Clara had returned to Willow Creek after the death of her grandmother, the only family she had left. Her grandmother's house, a crumbling Victorian mansion on the edge of town, was now hers. Clara had hoped to sell it and leave Willow Creek behind forever, but as she stepped inside, she felt an unease she couldn't shake. The air was heavy, and the walls seemed to whisper secrets she couldn't quite hear. The house was a relic of another time, filled with antique furniture, faded photographs, and strange trinkets that seemed to watch her as she moved through the rooms. Her grandmother had always been eccentric, but Clara had never realized just how much until now. The house felt alive, as if it were breathing, waiting. The first night, Clara dreamed of the woods. In her dream, she was walking through the forest, the trees towering above her like silent sentinels. The air was thick with fog, and she could hear footsteps behind her, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. She turned, but there was no one there. When she woke, she found mud on her feet and leaves in her hair. The townsfolk were no help. When Clara asked about the Hollow Men, they avoided her gaze, muttering about curses and bad omens. Only one person, an elderly librarian named Mrs. Greaves, would speak to her. "The Hollow Men are real," Mrs. Greaves said, her voice trembling. "They've been here since the town was founded. Some say they're the spirits of the original settlers, cursed for what they did. Others say they're something else entirely, something not of this world." "What did the settlers do?" Clara asked. Mrs. Greaves hesitated, then leaned in close. "They made a deal. The land here is barren, unfit for farming. But the settlers were desperate. They turned to other means. They performed a ritual, sacrificing their own to gain the favor of something ancient and malevolent. It worked, but at a cost. The Hollow Men are the price they paid." Clara left the library with more questions than answers. That night, the dreams returned. This time, she saw the ritual, a circle of hooded figures, their faces obscured, chanting in a language that made her skin crawl. In the center of the circle was a pit, dark and endless, and from it emerged something that defied description. It was vast and shapeless, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. The figures bowed before it, offering something, a child. Clara woke screaming, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew then that the dreams were more than just dreams. They were memories, her grandmother's memories. She had to know the truth. She spent the next day searching the house, tearing through dusty boxes and forgotten rooms. In the attic, she found a journal, her grandmother's. The pages were filled with frantic scribbles, diagrams of the forest, and notes about the ritual. Her grandmother had known about the Hollow Men, had even tried to stop them. But she had failed. As Clara read, she felt a presence behind her. She turned, but there was no one there. The air grew colder, and the whispers began, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. They were in her head, urging her to come to the woods, to finish what her grandmother had started. That night, Clara ventured into the forest, armed with nothing but a flashlight and the journal. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted like skeletal fingers. The whispers surrounded her, echoing in her mind. She pressed on, following a path that seemed to appear out of nowhere. After what felt like hours, she reached a clearing. In the center stood a massive, gnarled tree, its roots exposed and twisted like serpents. At its base was a hollow, dark and gaping, like a mouth. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices urging her closer. Clara hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to run, but something compelled her to stay. She stepped forward, peering into the hollow. Inside, she saw something that made her blood freeze, a human skull, its eye sockets glowing with a faint, green light. And beside it, a knife, its blade rusted and stained with blood. She knew what she had to do. She had to finish the ritual, to break the curse. But as she reached for the knife, the whispers turned into laughter, cruel and mocking. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and the tree let out a deafening roar. The light in the skull's eye sockets flared, and for a moment, Clara thought she had succeeded. But then, the whispers turned into screams, and the hollow began to expand, swallowing the tree and the ground around it. Clara stumbled back, but it was no use. The hollow was everywhere, consuming everything. As she was pulled into the darkness, Clara saw the truth. The Hollow Men were not spirits or curses, they were the remnants of the settlers, their souls trapped in a cycle of endless suffering. The ritual had bound them to the forest, and the only way to free them was to offer a new soul in their place. Clara's grandmother had tried to break the cycle, but she had been too late. Now, it was Clara's turn. She felt the darkness closing in, the whispers becoming a part of her. She saw the faces of the Hollow Men, their featureless visages twisting into expressions of sorrow and regret. And then, she saw her grandmother. Her face was calm, her eyes filled with love. "It's not your time," she said. "You have to fight." With a surge of strength, Clara plunged the knife into the skull. The light flared, brighter than the sun, and the hollow let out a final, ear-splitting scream. The ground shook, and the forest seemed to come alive, the trees writhing and twisting as if in agony. When the light faded, Clara was alone. The hollow was gone, the tree reduced to ash. The whispers were silent, and the air was still. The townsfolk never spoke of Clara Hayes again. The house on the edge of town remained empty, its windows dark and lifeless. But sometimes, on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear the whispers, calling out from the depths of the forest. And if you're foolish enough to follow them, you might just meet the hollow men. Clara left Willow Creek, but she knew she would never truly escape. The forest had marked her, and the whispers would always be there, in the back of her mind, reminding her of the price she had paid.